Okay, now what I'm going to do is we'll consider that to be the end of the DB2 session, but I will review, like I say, tomorrow with how to execute Java with the SQL commands in it. Okay, so we're going to move on to IMS. This actually is going to be a relatively quick session, and I want you to know that just because it's quick doesn't mean that IMS is simple. IMS is a hierarchical database, and you might ask yourself the question, well, why would anyone want to use a hierarchical database when you've got a relational database like DB2? Well, the answer to that is if you're ultimately after speed. Speed is the most important thing. And let's say, for instance, well, it takes a little bit more work to take care of and it's not as flexible. Well, that might be true, but speed is so important that that's what I want. Well, IMS is your database. And also, IMS has its own transaction processor. So by the time we're done, I want you to be able to describe the IMS environments and list 3 IMS components. So IMS, what we're looking at here is the 3 components. When you bring up an IMS environment, there's actually something called the System Services component. And the System Services component by itself is more like just a controlling environment. But then, under the IMS System Services, you can actually bring up a transaction manager. That transaction manager is typically, and in the past, used to be called DC, Data Communications. But now I think they refer to it as TM, it looks like, George. It's Transaction Manager component. You can also bring up a database manager for database components to talk to IMS. And like the DB2, it can log information about activity. So these are the 3 components. It's got a control facility known as the IMS System Services. It's got a transaction manager and a database manager. They've advanced IMS so that it is possible all of the IMS transaction managers that are talking to the IMS databases, there is facilities to web enable the IMS transactions. And that's what this represents here. It is possible to web enable IMS applications. The traditional way is using 3270 protocol to talk to the facilities of the IMS transaction manager that then in turn can talk to the IMS database. I'm going to be talking a little bit later about the DLI, which happens to be the Application Program Interface. And I won't get into a great deal of detail about how the transaction manager really works. I'll spend a little bit more time on the IMS database portion. Let me talk a little bit about the Application Program Interface. So you can write in different languages, and the Application Program Interface is known as the Data Language Interface. But what you do inside the application programs, let's say you're coding in COBOL, you actually use this thing called COBOL to DLI. And then after you call the COBOL to DLI, you pass it some parameters as to what you want to do. And so that's how a language would interface with IMS through the Application Program Interface. Each language, in this case, has its own Application Program Interface. This is the IMS Control Facility, the system services, and IMS can get very elaborate. So, example is down here. This is considered a message processing region, and each one of those boxes is a separate address space. So, for example, that's an address space, and notice these message processing regions for transaction processing. These can actually have, you can have many transaction processing regions, and you can open those up. Then you can have different things for working with things like databases. There's Java interfaces. But anyway, this environment, to set it up and to manage it, can take a little bit, significantly more work than DB2. And it's not very flexible, but it is very fast. So when they're pointing out IMS today, they're just pointing out that Java works well in this environment. And with Java, they've actually made administration a little bit easier. And the other thing that they're pointing out here is that the transaction manager of IMS can actually use DB2 as a data source. The IMS database can actually be used as a data source by WebSphere, by a DB2 stored procedure, or by CICS, which is another transaction manager we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So CICS can use IMS DB as a data source. The IMS transaction manager could potentially use DB2 as a data source. So you can mix and match a lot of these middleware components. As I mentioned, there's a difference between hierarchical databases and relational databases. I'm not going to get into the modeling of DB2 and IMS DB. However, the relationship between the different data elements is organized differently. And the hierarchical database is less flexible. Once you put it in place, you're pretty much committed to it, because if you change it, you might have to change programs. So let's just talk briefly about starting IMS. So you actually can create JCL that would invoke the IMS environment. And the first thing you do is you actually issue start, and you give it the name of the JCL procedure. And then this is actually the resource lock manager. It's a lock manager for IMS. This lock manager is a different component. Notice DXR for the 3 characters. But then when you start the IMS control region, now known as the system services, but we called our JCL in this case IMS 10 CR1, and notice DFS messages come out. DFS, the 3 identifying characters for IMS. So once you start the control region, then you can start the DL1 interface, which is for the application program interfaces. And you can start another region. And in this case, the way it's set up, when the way they configured it, if you start IMS 10 CR1, the people that actually customize this, which is in the room, it automatically issued this start command and this start command. Is that correct, George? Is that the way you configured it? If you issue that start of the JCL, the control region, it turns around and starts the DLI and the recon, correct? Right. So the person that configured that's in the room and confirmed that, the way he's got set up, it starts this internally generated command to start the API and the what's called the recon for keeping track of what's going on. Now, all this did was start the system services. And how it works, it puts out an outstanding reply in the operator log. And in the operator log, it actually says, there's other information, that it says some number, DFS 810A for action, IMS is ready. At this point, all that's up is the services. But then you can issue operator commands, and the way you talk to IMS is a little bit different. You actually reply to the outstanding reply of the service machine, and you pass it an IMS command. And there's a commands book. And the command we're passing it here, this is abbreviation for normal restart, checkpoint 0 format all, kind of bringing things up a little bit cold, reformatting things, and then it in turn starts more JCL. What JCL does it start? Well, that depends upon whoever installed it and how they decide to configure it. So in our case, when we started the services and then we did a normal restart, checkpoint freeze, or checkpoint 0 format all, when I said checkpoint freeze, that's how to bring it down. But in our case, all these address spaces are related to that IMS environment. Each time you respond or send the command IMS, of course, it will increment the ID number, and you can continue to talk to the to the IMS control region, also known as the IMS system services. To bring it down, you can reply and say checkpoint freeze. And then a whole bunch of activity will start to take a snapshot of where everything is and bring everything down. So that was a very, very rapid discussion of IMS. And IMS has a lot of detail involved in it, but I've chosen not to get into a huge amount of detail. And I won't get into a lot of the how the databases are really done or how the transactions are really defined. But there are indeed a great deal of professional manuals and documentation related to IMS, including red books.
There's a question.
Okay, there's a question on the chat. Why is IMS required? Well, it turns out, to directly answer that and to oversimplifying it, IMS is not really required. However, there are very, very large companies that implemented IMS in the late 1960s and the early 70s because it was one of the strongest environments around. And back in the early 70s, relational databases didn't exist. And IMS DB was one of the best database systems around. It was very fast, but not very flexible. But relational databases actually started getting created during the, I believe it was the mid to late 70s that they started building relational databases. So someone could say, I require IMS because I want the fastest database that there is. And if speed is the ultimate thing that you want, IMS is probably one of the best. However, with that being said, I will tell you now on the DB2 environment on ZOS, we're actually hooking up appliances to the mainframe that's really accelerating DB2, making it very fast for queries that could take a long time. What is used, what is it used for in the real world? Well, one thing that I used to use it for many years ago is, I'll give you a perfect business example, and it's one that I worked on. For building a commercial airplane, to build a commercial airplane, each plane that we were building required 750,000 tools to build the plane, and each tool ranged between 1 and 16 parts. The tools could be really large or they could be really small. A tool is defined as anything that's needed to put that plane together that's not on the plane when it leaves the ground. That's a tool. So with 750,000 tools with 16 parts, we've got to keep track of the tools. And also we have an assembly line of planes moving through. So you may need multiple tools because multiple people may need it, but then we don't want to lose the tools. The tools need to be checked in and checked out from the tool crib. Also, the plane may move from building to building, and different buildings need different tools. Also, we had different types of commercial aircraft. So we had tool cribs, and tools need to be checked in and checked out. The way we used to originally do this was with like an old library card catalog system, and everything was written. And who took out the tool, when they returned it, what shelf it was on, or where it was stored. So when we automated this in the early 70s, we used IMS. To this day, probably IMS is still used for keeping track of keeping track of tools for airplanes, because it was built, it was very fast, it worked really well. All you had to do was modify it to make it a little bit better or maintain it. So chances are it's probably still being used today. So that's one example. I do know in the financial community, IMS is being used. Another application I know IMS is being used for is in large department store retail, because large department store retail has a massive number of SKUs for every piece of merchandise they're selling. Like, for example, take a shirt. A shirt will have a different SKU for the color, or the size, the neck size, the arm length, tons of SKUs. And so there's so many of them, and when you're selling things and changing prices, the SKUs, the number of SKUs in a large retail department store is massive, and the database has to be very, very fast. Well, IMS was actually the prime database for that when a lot of those large retail systems were built. And so you can actually use a CICS transaction to talk to IMS DB. And if it was built a long time ago, you might still be using it.
I think IMS still holds the most data.
Well, there was a comment made in here in the room that IMS still holds the most amount of business data today. Now, I don't know how true it is. However, it might be true because the data that was stored inside of IMS back in the 70s, it was large. They were some of our largest corporations, largest enterprises that were doing things, putting a large amount of data in there. Okay. Another question, isn't this a matter for LDAP today? Well, good question, Peter, but LDAP itself really is I think that's the X500 protocol, and quite honestly, while it is kind of a database, most people use it for authentication, and it is LDAP. Now I think about it, is probably organized hierarchical, but it's probably not really meant for a huge, massive amount of data that's going to be used with high frequency. For authentication, it works out very nicely. But when you say, isn't this a matter for LDAP today? IMS and LDAP are different. Of course, LDAP came after IMS, but IMS probably has the engine and the technology for speed that LDAP may not. So that's probably the best way for me to answer that. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and, are there any other questions about IMS before I move forward?